Hello and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. And as of this past weekend, I think I got the news Friday or Saturday, I'm officially an award-winning short story writer. That's right. I'm so happy to self-promo this, super shameless. But yeah, I'm on the long list for the Brooklyn Caribbean Literary Festival Elizabeth Nunez Caribbean American Writers Prize. So it's a lot to get through. But yeah, I submitted this story, and me, along with a few other fantastic writers, had our short story selected for this prize. And so very happy to see that. And it's a story that's kind of fantasy adjacent too. I know some of you folks know that I like to do a lot of other genres as well, but that's fine. We're going to stick to fantasy as for today because it's fantasy writing for barbarians. So with all that said, we actually have an email. I'm going to bring it up here. And I haven't read this email beyond the subject line. Our wonderful producer, Natalia Emmons, already took a look at it and sent it my way. So I'm ready to read it for the first time. And it also looks like our other producer, Bridget Surdock, also followed up with some of their own thoughts as well. So we're going to get into all of that now. All right, so this email comes to us from Sarah, and Sarah wrote in the subject line, considering giving up ... Thoughts? Okay, I'm not a fan of giving up, but I do think that giving up can be a smart strategy sometimes. There is such a thing as strategically giving up, or even if you don't want it to sound so defeatist, instead of saying giving up, you can say delay or shelve, I think is like the more common term. It's like, I'm going to table this project, whatever I'm doing for now, and maybe work on something else. So sometimes giving up, I don't know, it has a negative connotation I don't always love. But anyway, here's the email. Sarah says, hi, team. I am currently facing a revisions conundrum, aren't we all, which I could use a little advice on. I've been writing fantasy fiction for most of my life, and my biggest struggle is that I start but never finish things. Last year, I finally finished my first full draft of a novel, which I started in 2019 and worked on intermittently through the years. After letting the draft sit for months and months, and in the meantime starting a new project that I've been really excited by, I picked it back up this week to start edits. I was worried that the biggest hurdle would be the overwhelming task of rehauling everything to make 5 years of an evolved story cohesive. But as I started outlining my plan and getting back into the draft, I realized the project just doesn't speak to me anymore, and I don't see it as anything I would ever actually want to publish. It's worth noting that I started that novel when I was 19, and now I'm in my mid-20s, so naturally my worldview has shifted significantly. I see a few potential paths forward, and I'm curious about what you would recommend. I could carry on attempting to edit the draft as it would be practicing my revision skills at the very least. Or I could simply admit this story is no longer representative of my identity as a writer and pronounce it dead, freeing up to commit my focus to my current project, which feels truer to who I am now. I'm also considering letting it sit longer in hopes I'll eventually find a way to rework it or scavenge it but I'm a bit reluctant to do that as I feel it will weigh on me just as another project I started and never finished. My big question is, how do you know when it's time to double your efforts versus time to cut your losses? Thanks so much. Best, Sarah. Well, Sarah, first of all, thank you. Thank you so much for writing in. So happy that you are honestly, like, even in this email, I can tell you have a really strong instinct for a closeness to taking care of yourself in this process, making sure that you are paying close attention to how am I feeling about this project and what is the conflict that I'm facing. It sounds like you have a lot of self-awareness, which is great. And I think that for sure, we probably have some of our own insights, but I think when it comes down to it, you are going to make the right decision for yourself. I think even reading the email, I think you know kind of what you already want to do, right? You kind of write it in there that you're like, well, you know what? It just seems like you want to move on, and maybe you're feeling I'm reading into this and projecting maybe a little bit, but maybe you're feeling a little bit of guilt, a little bit of like, this novel was important to me, how could I just turn my back on it? Look, I have absolutely 100% been where you are. I will say that I haven't been writing fantasy my whole life, so you have a huge you have a frog leap on me there. But my first novel that I published was when I was 26. And so I was in my mid 20s, and it was a novel I'd been working on for like 2 years. And I wrote that novel. I wrote the sequel to it. And so that novel is Killer Joy. It's actually right behind me on the bookshelf. a novel I truly just have so much care and affection for. But what happened to me is that, I wrote the novel, I wrote the sequel, and it went into kind of publisher limbo. The second book was trapped in edits, and then eventually the publisher went out of business, and I didn't have an agent, so I wasn't able to do anything with it. The rights went back to me, but I was already working on some other project. So that decision actually was made for me in the sense that I couldn't really finish the trilogy because I couldn't query it. I couldn't go to agents and be like, yeah, I have the sequel to, I have two sequels to this book that's already been published by somebody else. And so it wouldn't be a debut. So I was kind of in a really tricky position. So I had to essentially stop working on it. And it was really sad because, like you, I had written it in a very specific time of my life. But as the years went on, I was working on other things and I was writing more things. I was learning more about how to write effectively, how to structure things, how to outline, how to find things that I was more passionate about when it comes to writing. And when it came down to it, I did get to this point where I considered self-publishing. I was like, you know what? Maybe because I'm sure an agent wouldn't pick this up, I could just put it out there on my own, right? It would be a huge risk financially because self-publishing is definitely not cheap. And we're talking about self-publishing 3 books. And I was like, well, if I was going to do that, what I would have to do is I'd have to probably rework it, kind of similar to what you're talking about here. I'd have to go back to that first book and I'd have to fix certain things. I'd have to basically adjust it to match what kind of writer I am now, because you want your debut to be really strong. I mean, you want the marketing, you want to take advantage of that oomph you're going to get the first time. You don't want to squander that opportunity. And Bronnie, my mentor, she always says this. She really is an advocate for strategic debuts, for being really careful about how you enter the marketplace. And so that pushed me into being like, all right, well, if I'm going to put this book out again, it really has to be extra polished. The problem then that came through is like the passion wasn't really there anymore. Maybe there was a passion for finishing the series, but even then, it was like I didn't feel it. I didn't feel that urge. I didn't feel that compulsion to finish it. And I've been on both sides of this, right? Where maybe you're hearing that and you're like, well, that's one, aspect of it. There are other people who would maybe look at it differently. I did look at it differently for a little while. So the Pixar Theory book, kind of a similar situation actually, but that's an example where I did double my efforts. So that's to say this is nuanced and it's not wrong for you to consider it, right? So the story with the Pixar book is that book originally comes out in 2015. Back then there's like 20, 21 movies that have come out through Pixar, right? I didn't even have Inside Out as part of that one because the book was already set to be published. It was like right after Inside Out came out. And so it finished up at like Monsters University or whatever. And so that book comes out in 2015. It does super well, right? And a couple of years pass, and people are asking, like, hey, can you do a new version of the book? And you can add more chapters to it. Because at that point, I was just doing new chapters on my blog. And eventually I was like, well, you know what? I at a certain point, if I'm going to do a whole new book of this, I would same kind of thing. I would want to go back and I would want to make it better. The original book was published to be short. It was a very short book, like 100 pages. And I was like, well, I would want it to be a bit longer, right? Like adding a few more movies isn't going to do the trick. So I was like, well, is there a creative way I could do it? Is there a new framing device I could do for that book? It's a nonfiction, right? So I'm not as experienced with nonfiction. So it took me some while to think it up. But again, the publisher that I was working with went out of business. They were the ones who wanted to take on the project. And so I was kind of in a similar issue. And a few years passed and I went through that same thing where I was like, my passion isn't really there anymore. And I was also in this tricky place where I was like, well, I don't want to query agents for a nonfiction because I'm working on fantasy novels. I'm working on other things. I don't want to pigeonhole myself into nonfiction when I only have plans to publish one more nonfiction book, right? And so these conundrums are why it's so helpful to find mentors, to find people who really know their stuff. Even you're reaching out to our podcast, and I'm deeply appreciative of that. And I'm sure, I'm going to do my best to help you out. However, there are other people who are way more equipped, who know this industry so much better than I do, who could probably really give you that hands-on advice that really works like on a deep level for your project. Because I did finish the Pixar book. It took me a while, but I did double my efforts. I did work really hard on getting those chapters out. And so, yeah, now it's on that track, right? Where I'm trying to get it published. And I'm still kind of facing the issue where I'm trying to be really careful with how I position it and where it's landing in my career and all that stuff. All that to say, it's totally valid for you to double your efforts. My only thing is that I was doubling my efforts with something that had been published before, that had an audience. It had people who really wanted the book, for sure, right? There are people to this day who still reach out all the time, almost, yeah, pretty much every day at this point. People are like, hey, when is the book coming out? I really want to read it. And so it can be really frustrating for me because I want those people to get that book that they want. And as opposed to the fantasy trilogy, I don't get that same kind of thing because I think there isn't that same sort of like, I need to know what happens next with that book because the first book does work pretty well as a standalone. So people who liked it, they've been waiting for the sequel, but, it wasn't as popular as the Pixar book, right? So I don't feel that same kind of urge to like put that book out. And so I want to put my energy, my investment into a new project that I am passionate about. And that is the thing. You talked about it right there in the email. If the project isn't really speaking to you anymore and you can't find that thread and that layer, then forcing it, I don't think that that is a good way to work on your revision. I think that your instinct to maybe put it off as opposed to pronouncing it dead is better. And that's what I've been telling myself with the Killer Joy books, which is like, yeah, maybe I will come back to it someday. Maybe I will. And always having that on the table is kind of nice, right? And it frees me up to be like, all right, I'm not going to focus on that now. I'm not going to work on that now. I'm going to work on this book that I'm excited about, that I have these ideas for, and that I want to really give the business, right? So that's my number one piece of advice there. And in terms of other stuff, I think that finishing finishing anything is still finishing it, even if you don't publish it, right? Like you did finish this book, and that matters. Like you crossed the finish line that most people don't. And I think you should hold space for that accomplishment. I think that revision doesn't always have to be this thing that leads to publication. I have plenty of books that I finished that probably never will be published. And that's okay because I'm always working on the next one. So it's okay. It's a lot like muscle building, right? It's like you're learning how your brain works in the long run, and your taste and your skills are just naturally going to evolve. And it's good for you to stay on track with that evolution. And it sounds like you've outgrown this book a little bit, and that's okay. The book itself doesn't owe you anything, or you don't owe that book anything. If the story no longer reflects who you are, then yeah, you're growing. That's not a sign of failure at all, in my opinion, at least. I mean, you're not the same writer at 25 that you were at 19, nor should you be, right? You need to ask yourself, like, okay, well, am I revising this out of guilt or genuine curiosity? If it's genuine curiosity, that's really cool. It's more of a like, I have an idea to maybe make this thing come alive. I've been in that position too with a book that I was like, oh, I have an idea maybe to fix it or whatever, or to make it even better. But if it's coming from guilt, that's a totally different thing. I think that at that point, you're just not being true to who you are. You're being true to a version of yourself that might not even exist anymore, right? So I think revising a book that you've fallen out of love with can still teach you some critical skills. Like if you wanted to revise it for practice, that's totally fine. You can like tighten POVs and do stuff like that, but you have to be clear about the why, like the why behind you're doing it. And if you're dreading doing it, that tells you everything you need to know. It tells you that, yeah, don't be don't be doing something that you don't want to do, right? I think that every draft too can have parts that are worth stealing, right? Another thing is that if you focus on the next thing, there are maybe things from that original draft that do still speak to you that you could kind of incorporate into the new draft, right? So you shouldn't think of it as abandoning the book, right? But you can cannibalize it. Maybe a kind of an extreme way to put it, but you know what I mean, right? Like you can cannibalize plot ideas and turns of phrase, elements of the setting that were really unique and cool, stuff that still excites you, but that you could organically incorporate into the next thing. I've done that before a lot, actually. I've worked on entire magic systems. I was like, oh, this is really cool. But I was like, the story's not there. And then I'll work on something else. And I'm like, oh, hey, that's where this would work, right? So it can work that way too, especially if the story has been in your head for so long. I'm sure stuff that's going to come to you very naturally that you're not going to even have to look for it. It's just going to pop in your head as you're working on the new draft, right? And so, yeah, I'd say that as long as you're making a conscious choice, an empowered choice in this situation, and you're letting yourself move on, without shaming yourself, then I think you're good. Me personally, I would leave behind the finished draft and not call it quitting. I don't think you should call it quitting or giving up. I think that's putting too much harsh critique on yourself that is unnecessary in this case. It sounds to me more like what you would be doing in this case is redirecting your efforts, right? You are, and sometimes it's the more mature thing to do, honestly, because you're letting something stay in the past, you're letting go of something, and that's a huge part of your 20s, honestly. That's one of the number one things I learned in my 20s was learning how to let go of things, how to let things stay in the past and making room for what was coming next. It's a hard lesson to learn and it applies to lots of different things, but it's a natural part of life. It's a natural part of this period of your life. I'm in my 30s now. I'm like halfway through and I'm learning new things. So, but learning that particular lesson has helped me so much in, my further kind of growth as a person, as a writer, and all that good stuff. And so, whether you double down or if you decide to move on, I think as long as you're doing it deliberately, right? And not doing it because you're being indecisive or being like, well, you ended up making the decision by not doing anything, by not making any decision. I don't like that. I think you should decide it, you should declare it, and move forward. That's the number one thing. All right, I want to look at what Bridget had to say, our wonderful producer, Bridget Surdock. Bridget said, first off, congrats. You finished your first draft. That's an awesome accomplishment and you should be very proud. That's years of work that you followed through on. You did it, which means you can do it again. Second, 5 years is a really long time to be working on one project, especially at a time in your life when you're going through a lot of mental changes. Your brain only just finished developing, maybe. The whole prefrontal cortex developing at 25 years old is an estimate after all. Yeah, I was about to say, like, Bridget's the science person. And I was like, hey, hold on, Bridget. I'm pretty sure that whole thing is kind of but whatever. So your decision making skills and worldview are undoubtedly way different than they were when you were 19. It's okay to no longer fully jive with the way you thought and felt back then. Third, I feel obligated to add that it's really easy to be overcome by new idea fever. I am a constant victim of it myself. You work on one thing for a while, then another idea floats along and you chase after that one because it's new and exciting. It's easy and gives the dopamine you're chasing by creating art. I get it. Believe me. And it becomes even easier when you actually complete one of those ideas. It's easy to lose interest in an old project when you have a new one to focus on, especially when it took you 5 years to finish the first one and you no longer feel like it represents you. So I think it's worth examining if this is actually you outgrowing the project you worked on for years or if it's just new idea fever. A hard thing to distinguish, believe me. Good luck, soldier. That's a little saluting guide in case John doesn't know. Yeah, I did. Oh, 07 is embarrassing. Fourth, and this I feel is most important. See, I told you all I read these for the first time. Fourth, and this I feel is most important. You got to chase your joy. I know this might seem contradictory to what I just said, but if what you're doing isn't fun or doesn't bring you joy, you probably shouldn't do it anymore. Your audience will be able to tell whether you loved what you were writing or not. The best art is created by people who love what they're doing and get a little weird about it. So channel your inner Marie Kondo and ask yourself, does this spark joy? If the answer is a resounding no, then you have your answer. Last thing I will leave you with is the wise words of the folks over at Drawfee. Delete your art. If it's not working, if you're getting frustrated, if you simply just don't love the way it's turning out, delete it and start over. You don't have to necessarily delete the whole thing, but get rid of what's not working. That first attempt was your warm up. It wasn't wasted. You were just getting into the groove. Now you're loose and warmed up and ready to try again. Your first novel attempt might not work anymore, and that's cool. You are welcome to take the idea and start over, be it today or in 10 years from now. You're also welcome to say F it and do something else entirely. Yeah, and Bridget knows firsthand from working with me on stuff that I literally rewrote a whole novel from scratch because I had been working on it for about a year, and actually it was like 2 years. And I was working on it, and I was like, this book, it's there. It just has like a couple of like fundamental issues with it. If I could just fix it. So what I ended up doing is I was like, you know what? I'm going to start this book entirely over. I'm going to start from chapter one. It was completely rewritten. And you know what ended up happening? My favorite things, the best things, in my opinion, from that novel, from the first few revisions, entered the total revision just on their own. It was one of the most enjoyable writing experiences I've ever had. And so much of what Bridget said here is just like so spot on because new idea fever. I love that terminology because we've talked about on the show many times when we've talked about outlining. One of the things that happens a lot, I'm not sure if it's happened with Sarah here, but I know it's happened with a lot of people who've reached out to us and that we've seen kind of in the community is that people will get excited about an idea. They'll get like 5 to 10 chapters in, maybe, right? They'll do a huge chunk of the book and then all the momentum disappears. Something might happen. Maybe they go on a trip or maybe things get a little bit busy and they miss a couple of days of writing. And then all of a sudden they're not excited about it anymore. And new idea fever kind of staves off, or they get stuck. They're like, I feel like I have to go back. I have to revise. I was on such a high when I was writing this, and I have to go back and I have to edit it. And one of the things that actually Bridget brings up here that's really important is that if you're in this situation where you're feeling like you have to keep going back and you keep losing that excitement, find ways to renew that excitement. It's not easy. You have to do it deliberately, but you can do it. One of the things that can help a lot with this is reframing the story, working on an outline. This is why pantsing novels is not something I recommend for most people, because it's so easy to fall into this. Because if you're just pantsing and you're discovery writing without any sort of blueprint, then what ends up happening is, yeah, as soon as you lose that momentum, you lose track. It's hard for you to kind of see the bigger picture. It's a lot easier for you to give up. But if you actually holistically look at your novel and ask yourself very specific questions, and please refer to our outline episode. We've talked about it before. Outlining is not just like chapter 1, this happens, chapter 2, this happens. No. Outlining is a very specific developmental writing process. It is writing, for example, a paragraph of like, what is this story? How would I market this story to somebody? What is the gut emotional appeal of the story? What's the plausibility of the main character? What's the inherent conflict? What makes the setting immersive? What is the originality of this story? Write that kind of thing out. Ask yourself more questions. How long do I really want it to be? What are some names that I think would be a nice little a vibe for this? What is the main character's wound? The thing that the trauma or the thing that happened in their past that informs who they are. Build these things ahead of time. Create a skeleton, right? You can still discovery write as you maneuver your way through that skeleton. But what renews your excitement for the story is going to that and being like, oh yeah, this is a cool story. When you read that pitch paragraph and you're like, oh yeah, this is where it's headed. And then you just open the floodgates for yourself of like, I know where this is going. It doesn't mean that every beat is defined. It just means that you have an idea of where it's going to go and you have the freedom to change it as you go. But you still have some kind of engine that is driving the car rather than trying to like hijack a new car for excitement every single time you try to pick up, a pen or computer or wherever to write this thing. So, okay, that was a lot of advice, probably a little too much, but thank you so much for writing in, Sarah. And thank you so much for all of you who are checking out Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. We really appreciate it. We have the YouTube channel if you're watching, but we also have a podcast if you want to listen only. Either is fine. And if you're a fan of Fantasy Writing for Barbarians, or if you have your questions, anything you want to hit us up with, please, please, please just email us, fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com. Relevant links are in the show notes, including our Discord, where you can hang out with us and talk about writing. There's a conversation that's been going on in the writing channel about romance stuff, and specifically some maybe not great opinions about romance that I won't get into. You'll have to find it yourself, but I haven't weighed in yet. I want to. But anyway, that's all for me today. Thank you so much. See you on the next one, and be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.